stable. We might have issues with the projectors here in the room, but we will deal with that as we do. But it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Meredith MacGregor, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Astrophysics and Planetary Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research group uses multi-wavelength astronomical observations to explore the formation and habitability of planetary systems. And her work has been widely covered in popular press, including the New York Times, Scientific America, and National Geographic. She is a Scilog Fellow and co-chair of the NASA Infrared Science and Technology Integration Group. And previously she was a NSF Astronomy and Astrophysics postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie here in DC after completing her PhD in astrophysics at Harvard in 2017. So thank you, Meredith, for coming to speak with us.
I always hate the part where bio get read. Embarrassing. Okay, hopefully. There we go. That way that won't be on top of all my slides. Hopefully everybody can hear me online. I have no idea if that's working, so we'll go with please type something in the chat if that's not happening. And I am super excited to come and talk with you guys today. Spur of the moment trip, since I was going to be out at Maryland tomorrow anyway, so why not? So I was going to go through a talk on how to form a habitable planet, which is sort of, I need to stand like actually holding it. That's okay. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Ooh. Even better. Feels like a little over amplification for the tiny room, but okay, we'll go with this. So let's get started. My computer will agree. Okay. So I have to do an introduction at first to my research group because a lot of the things that I'm going to show today have been done by many of the amazing students and postdocs working with me. So all of their names are on the left there. So I have 5 undergrads working with me right now, 4 grad students and a postdoc, and I've already had 3 undergrads who have come through the group and moved on to other things. So you'll see their names in purple as we go through different projects that they've worked on. But overall, the theme of our work is trying to understand how planetary systems form and evolve over time, and to think about how we might look for habitability in those planetary systems, how we might be able to characterize these different planetary systems and think about whether they might host life or not. And this is a lovely Zoom picture because I started at CU in January of 2020. So we got to be a pandemic research group, and many of my students I didn't meet in person for a couple of years. So fun. Okay, so I know this is the exoplanet seminar, so I don't need to dwell on this, right? But I always like to start talks with an overview of how stars and planets actually form to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we start with a giant molecular cloud, right? And pieces of this cloud become overdense and they collapse to form new stars. And those stars are surrounded by what we call a protoplanetary disk. So this is sort of a gas-rich, dust-rich, massive disk, which is the point at which we think there's enough material to actually form planets. That disk lasts for somewhere on the order of 1 to 10 million years, large error bar. And eventually, most of the material is cleared away. And we're left with a main sequence star, any planets that managed to form, and the remnant material, which is what we call a debris disk. So debris disks you can think of like the Kuiper Belt in our own solar system. These are icy comets and asteroids that are now colliding and grinding down. Okay, so to draw the distinction between those 2 classes of disks, maybe a bit clearer, on the left, these are all images from the ALMA D-Sharp survey of protoplanetary disks. So these are, again, pre-main sequence stars, rich in sort of primordial gas material. Only time we really have enough mass for giant planet formation. So I always like to think of these as sort of the reservoirs of planet formation. And on the right are ALMA images of debris disks, now around main sequence stars. They do, in fact, have gas, although in this case, the gas we think is coming from cometary collisions. So these are comets that are now whapping into each other and outgassing things like CO. And so I always like to call debris disk sort of the fossil record of planet formation, because that whole process of planet formation has imprinted itself into the material that's now grinding and colliding and getting sculpted by planets. So we can observe any of these disks at both evolutionary stages across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And depending upon the wavelength we pick, we are actually looking at different emission mechanisms. So these are all images of AUMIC, which is one of the only debris disks known around an M-type star. And when we look in the optical through about the near infrared, we're actually seeing scattering, so light that's scattering off of tiny dust grains in the disk. And as we move to the mid-IR and all the way out to the long radio, now we're seeing thermal emission. So these grains are actually getting heated up by the central star, and as a result, they're glowing at these long wavelengths. So the top image here is actually taken with SPHERE, which is a really fun image because you can actually see these waves that are moving out along the left side of the disk. And then the bottom panels are all thermal images taken with Herschel, ALMA, and even the VLA out at a centimeter wavelength. So we can look at structure in these disks at high resolution and also as a function of wavelength, so we can really get this very complete picture of planet formation. And kind of planet formation has had a real renaissance, I'd say, in the last 10 years, and a lot of that is due to the fact that ALMA came online 10 years ago. So ALMA is the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array. This is a picture of ALMA. It's at 17,000 feet of elevation down in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And the antennas, which you can see in the middle, can be reconfigured so that they actually span up to 16 kilometers, which gives ALMA a resolution of less than 1/100th of an arcsecond. So prior to ALMA, when we gave talks about debris disks, they looked a lot like this, which there's some structure. There's some pretty ones, but a lot of them look like blobs, right? And so we didn't have this complete picture of what's actually going on in these disks. And with ALMA, they all now look like this. So I just like to flash back and forth. And you can see that disks that looked like complete blobs now have multiple rings and gaps and structure, and we see asymmetries and warps. And so we have this completely new picture of what the process of planet formation looks like, and a totally new angle to come at to try and model these systems and infer properties of planetary systems from their structure. Okay, so I said that this was not just about disks, but about looking and forming habitable planets. So where does that come in? We astronomers like to make the simplest definition of habitability. And it's nice, because I can draw a Goldilocks zone on this plot, and it's convenient, but it's not complete, right? We define planetary habitability just what we can study easily at the moment, which is, does this planet have the right temperature to allow for it to have liquid water on its surface, assuming it is an Earth-like planet with an atmosphere? But if I really wanted to dig into habitability, there's a lot of other things that I might start asking about, right? Distance from the star is one thing, but I do actually need to know if that planet has an atmosphere. I would like to know how large it is, and whether that's a large enough planet to have a molten core to allow it to have a magnetic field which is going to protect its atmosphere. I might care about its rotation rate, since that's going to affect whether it has a rotation, right? Plate tectonics. I might care what the star is actually doing in this system, since stars can be quite damaging to atmospheres. I might also care if it even got volatiles inherited into the planet in the first place. How did it get water, or CHNOPS, all of our elements that we need for life? And in our planetary system, I think it's fascinating the role that Jupiter has played in terms of stirring up material to actually deliver water to Earth, but also protecting Earth later from having too many impacts and sterilizing the planet. So what I want to do is kind of go through two of these to start, areas in which we can use disks and stars to actually place constraints on planetary habitability. So let's start with a pretty basic question, which is, do other planetary systems have outer giant planets? And we don't actually have a good answer for this right now, right? Because our current ways of detecting exoplanets are pretty biased in the types of planets that we can detect. So if I throw up a mass period diagram for our known, this is out of date, but 4,000 to 5,000 exoplanets. There's a lot of things that are smaller. There are big planets, but they tend to be on really close orbits. Because we haven't known about exoplanets for long enough to sit around for 100 and something years and wait for Neptune to transit anything, right? So we're just never going to do it. And we're probably never going to do that anyway, because we are never going to have that kind of baseline with one facility to look for Neptune. So this entire chunk of the plot here, which is our Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune analogs, is unprobed by the way that we currently detect exoplanets. Our best hope here is probably to do really awesome chronographic imaging in the future. But as planetary systems get older and older, they get fainter and it gets harder and harder. So what else can we do? So I would argue that actually we can do a lot with disk structure, because these disks are Kuiper belt analogs. They are probing the outer regions of planetary systems. And if you imagine a planet that's orbiting inside of a disk of comets, it's going to gravitationally sculpt that belt of material. And it would likely produce a whole variety of structure, right? You might expect to see things like warps and clumps and eccentricity and carved out gaps. And there are two kind of easy examples where this works well. The left is Beta Pictoris, which is a really well-studied debris disk. And it has a known directly imaged giant planet in it, Beta Pic B. And Beta Pic B is on a slightly inclined orbit relative to the plane of the disk, so it actually is kinking the interior of the disk because of its inclined orbit. And in our own planetary system, the Kuiper belt has been shaped by Neptune. If you plot the orbits of Kuiper belt objects and look at the classical Kuiper belt objects, the ones that aren't on really crazy eccentric orbits, they're confined between the 3:2 and 2:1 orbital resonances with Neptune. So we think that Neptune actually plowed outwards early in the solar system history and basically swept all of these remnant Kuiper belt objects up into this narrow belt. So if we go out and we look at other debris disks, we should be able to image their structure, model that, and then infer the properties of potential planets creating that structure. So let's look at a couple examples where that works nicely. So Fomalhaut is perhaps one of the prettiest debris disks. It was first imaged with Hubble by Paul Callis back in about 2005. And it's this lovely image here that everybody always says looks like the Eye of Sauron. It has a potential planet in it, Fomalhaut B, which is marked by that funky orbit. Fomalhaut B was originally detected in the STIS imaging, and then subsequent follow-up showed that it was not there anymore, and that it might actually be a disappearing dust cloud. And even if it was there, it's on an orbit that is very wonky compared to the disk. But the disk is fascinating and noticeably eccentric, which is why everybody was very excited about this planet, because it could be sculpting this eccentric disk. So this is the Hubble image, and then we imaged it with ALMA. And I've overlaid a few things here to sort of guide your eye. The disk is visibly eccentric, so the pink cross is actually marking where the center would be if I just threw a center on the disk. And the orange dot is actually the star detected by ALMA. So you can see the offset between the centroid and the star just by eye. The upper side of the disk is the apocenter. It's the farther away side, and the lower side of the bottom of the slide in green is pericenter. So that's the closer point in the orbit. And I threw the planet's orbit on here just for fun. So we have now actually gotten new data, which my grad student is working on, which is even higher resolution ALMA data of Fomalhaut. So this is a combined map. We've combined all of the available ALMA data on Fomalhaut and made the highest resolution map to date. And why is that interesting? So because Fomalhaut is eccentric, it actually leads to some very interesting surface density effects in the actual distribution of dust in the disk. So this is a lovely cartoon of a planet on a Keplerian orbit that's slightly eccentric. And because planets sweep out equal areas in equal times, it means that this planet is actually moving faster at pericenter than it is at apocenter. So it slows down considerably at apocenter. And this is true in an eccentric debris disk with all of the comets moving on orbits in an eccentric debris disk. And what it means is that actually we detect what we call apocenter glow in Fomalhaut, which you can see that the apocenter side of the disk is brighter than the pericenter side of the disk, because bodies are moving slower at apocenter, so you end up with a surface density enhancement. So we see more material that's getting heated up and glowing at these long wavelengths because of that surface density enhancement. Now, it gets even more interesting. This is looking at just that new high resolution data, and right now I'm flashing between the pericenter and apocenter sides of the disk. If the disk is actually not just eccentric, but sculpted by a planet, we can predict that there should be a width variation as a function of azimuthal angle in the disk. So the planet will actually cause different parts of the disk to be narrower and wider. And so you can see this change in this high resolution image between the surface density profile and the width of the disk between apocenter and pericenter. So it's actually narrower at one side of the disk versus the other. So because we have this 1 AU resolution with ALMA, and we can now model this and place very precise constraints on potential planets that could be sculpting the disk. Okay, so eccentricities are fun. What about gaps? So this is another debris disk, HD 15115. It has been well studied because when imaged with STIS in scattered light, it shows this bizarre asymmetry. So the disk is edge on, so you're sort of viewing it on its side, and the left side of the disk is smushed compared to the right side of the disk. They're different extensions, which is weird. So the initial explanation for this was actually that this disk is slamming into the interstellar medium. So it's basically like ramming into some dense interstellar cloud that's causing grains to get stripped out of the disk. So the left side is where it's hitting the ISM, and the right is where you get this ram pressure stripping, pulling grains out of the disk. So we were curious what this looks like with larger grains, the millimeter grains that ALMA is sensitive to. So this is now the ALMA image overlaid on the Hubble image, and then just by itself on the right. And it doesn't look at all like the Hubble image. It shows no evidence for the extension that we see in scattered light. Instead, the ALMA image actually shows evidence that it has multiple rings. And I realize not everybody stares at debris disk images, so we get the donut primer. Okay, so you can think of your debris disk as a donut of material, right? And if I imagine a donut that's face on, and I draw lines of sight through this donut, I'm going to be seeing even amount of donut no matter where I pick my line of sight. So I should expect even contours around the entire donut. Now, if I take my donut and I tip it on its edge, and I start drawing lines of sight through it, if I pick one on the edge, it's going to be donut all the way through. But if I pick one right through the middle, it's going to be donut, hole, donut. So I actually expect to see what we call onsci, or limb brightening, where you see more flux from the edge, these sort of like handles that are coming from the edge of the donut, and a deficit of emission from the middle because there's a hole. Okay, so this makes more sense now. In this image, the middle dot is actually the star, and then there's two blobs on either side, which are those onsci of both of the donuts, the inner donut and then the outer donut. So we can then model this because it looks like there's a gap being carved out in this disk between these two rings. And so if we imagine what could possibly carve out a gap is a planet, we can model the disk and pull out the radius and width and depth of that gap, and then analytically derive a mass from the planet that could be responsible for that, which gives us a mass of something like 0.2 Jupiter masses. The bottom here is actually showing N-body simulations from Rebound, where we actually took a 0.2 Jupiter mass planet, put it into a simulation with a disk that has the appropriate mass, and let it run for 1 million years to confirm that, in fact, a planet of that mass can open a gap. And so it's showing a surface density plot on the left, and then sort of a cut through the disk on the right. And you can play around with the eccentricity a little bit, and having a higher eccentricity orbit actually allows you to open up a bigger gap with a slightly smaller mass planet. Okay, so now I get to show fun images of things I get to work on with Chris. So some disks have both eccentricities and maybe gaps in them, right? We get to see eccentricities and then gaps and then really crazy systems. So this is HD 53143, which was imaged by Hubble with STIS and ACS. And it's this lovely blue image here, which is not the most impressive image of a disk that I've shown. And it was confusing at first because what it looks like is that there maybe were like a face-on disk that had some clumps in it. Maybe these are resonances. So we tried to image it with ALMA. Looks like this. So the new ALMA data shows a completely different structure, and it is in fact highly eccentric. So again, you can remember back to Fomalhaut. That center peak is the star, which in this case is even more dramatically offset from the centroid of that disk. And we also see the same apocenter glow. So if you look at the upper right part of the disk, you see this brightening at apocenter. This disk is about twice as eccentric as Fomalhaut is, so it has an eccentricity of like 0.2. So it's the most eccentric debris disk we've ever imaged. And the new paper coming out, because we imaged this again with Hubble, and it doesn't show the same sort of face-on thing that the original Hubble image does, but it also doesn't agree very well with the ALMA image, which is a great, fun mystery. The Hubble image seems to more suggest that the disk is puffy, has a higher potential scale height, so if you thicken your disk, whereas the ALMA image wants the disk to be completely thin. So there's some interesting things going on in the system outside of just having an eccentric disk, because in this case, it looks like the small and the large grains are potentially being shaped by different processes. Because the ALMA image traces millimeter grains. We effectively, wavelength of observation traces size of grain. So when you look at the millimeter, you see millimeter grains. When you look with Hubble and the micron wavelengths, you're seeing micron size grains. So there's some difference between the tiny grains and the larger grains. And what's even more interesting is that if I fit an eccentric model to this disk, it does a relatively good job, but still leaves considerable residuals. So this is showing the data on the left, and then the model in the middle, and then the resulting residuals if I just subtract that model away. So it fits the outer emission very well, right? But those are 6 sigma contours in the middle. So there's considerable emission coming from the inner part of this disk that we're just not accounting for with this kind of simple outer disk model. So the best guess is that actually those inner contours are coming from a second disk in the system that we're just not resolving currently with ALMA, and that in this lovely artist impression, there's a second disk that is actually potentially edge-on, so more highly inclined, which would indicate that there's kind of an outer Kuiper belt, then like an inner asteroid belt analog, and that they're misaligned from each other. If that's true, that would be a really interesting dynamical situation, because you would have to have had something happen to actually misalign the disks early in the system's evolution. And we will hopefully get an answer, because we have a new program, with ALMA this cycle, to actually image this with 1 AU resolution and get a really high resolution view of the disk that would resolve well this inner belt if it is there. Okay, so disk structure, hopefully, I have proven, can actually maybe give us a new handle on outer planetary systems. Because when we look at disks, rings and gaps appear to be common. We see them in all of these disks, right? I just throw up a few images, but no disk is free of substructure. And this is a new version of that mass semi-major axis plot for exoplanets, but now I've plopped down on here as those little colored symbols all the planets that are inferred from these rings and gaps. So if I take all this structure and I model it and I infer planetary masses and orbits, suddenly we're completely populating the whole other side of the plot that we're missing. And I'm also very excited because we have a new program that we're executing with ALMA this cycle. That's a large program, so it's about 200 hours of ALMA time to look at a couple dozen debris disks and take really high-resolution images of all of them. And that will be a pretty exciting treasure trove of new data and potentially new inferred planets. And just to highlight a few other disk things, I think we can also gain some interesting information on dynamics of planetary systems by looking at sort of the mutual inclinations of disks and stars and planets, right? It's always been kind of an open question of how we get hot Jupiters. Are they scattered in? And if they are getting scattered, we might expect to see misalignments between sort of the disks that they formed from and the actual stellar inclination. So I had an undergrad student for his honors thesis. He was working to basically take all of the ALMA resolved debris disks, well constrain their inclinations, and then use test data to get the stellar inclinations. And it was long assumed that basically debris disks and stars were always perfectly aligned. There have been multiple papers that there was no problem here. And when we redid this analysis, it actually looks like there's several systems that have significant misalignments. So you can kind of see them in the red here, are at least 5 debris disks that have considerable misalignments from their star. One of them is Epsilon Eridani, which has like a warm Jupiter in it and a considerably misaligned debris disk relative to the stellar inclination. And of course, I have to put a caveat in here, right? Because it's nice to tell a story that the structure is all due to planets, and I can look at disks and we can model them and we can infer all these planets. But disks are complicated, and there are a lot of other dynamics that can happen. So here's an example of a disk, HD 61005, which has these wings to it. So the disk is actually being curved away from the plane. This is another edge on disk, but it looks like a moth, right? And I've been working with Anne-Marie Madigan to test her models of an inclination instability. So she's developed a model to actually try and explain Planet 9 by saying that if you have enough material, you can actually have mutual self-gravity between these hyperbelt objects, and that they can excite inclinations in their orbit just because of their self-gravity. And we can apply this to debris disks and actually produce, these are all model images, produce models of the disk that recreate this wing structure just by having self-gravity and enough material in the outer parts of the disk. So hopefully, with some new higher resolution ALMA observations, we'll be able to test this as well. Okay, so I'm going to take an abrupt turn away from disks and look at the center part of planetary systems, because I firmly believe that we cannot actually understand planetary habitability unless we look at all parts of that planetary system. So let's talk about stellar activity for a second. Stars are active, right? They send out bursts of high energy radiation, what we call flares, and bursts of charged particles, which are called CMEs, or coronal mass ejections. And those particles and radiation travel through space and can impact a planetary atmosphere. And for our Earth, we have a magnetic field, right, that protects most of that from getting into our atmosphere. But things still get in through the poles, and that can actually essentially modify the atmosphere of the planet. So it can dissociate molecules like water and ozone in the atmosphere, split them apart, lead to erosion of the atmosphere, at very least photochemical changes in the atmosphere of the planet. On our planet, this is nice, because it's CMEs that cause aurora. It's the dissociation of molecules in our atmosphere at the poles that actually let us see beautiful aurora. On other planets, this can be much more dramatic. So we need to better understand the processes by which stars flare, their emission mechanisms, their energies, the rates of these flares. And it's very hard to do that with only one wavelength of light, because stars flare across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and different wavelengths actually trace different emission mechanisms. So the left is sort of showing a cartoon of how we think a flare structure happens, right? So we typically think of flares as having magnetic field lines that are threading down through the photosphere of the star. As the star convects, the foot points of those field lines actually move around, and it twists up the lines. Eventually, there's a snapping, a reconnection, because there's too much magnetic tension, And that releases this burst of radiation and energy that is the flare. And then the lines reconnect into a smoother loop structure. If you're looking at the top part of that flare where that reconnection is actually happening, we see that in sort of the high energy ultraviolet and radio emission, where we're actually seeing synchrotron emission. Electrons actually getting spiraled around these field lines and sent out. And at the bottom, at the foot points, you're actually seeing heating in like optical and X-ray wavelengths, where heat from that initial reconnection has traveled down the magnetic field line, is now heating the surface of the star. And on the right, these are just images of our sun, taken at different wavelengths of light, which is a super narrow wavelength range. But visually, you can just see that even between 100 and 1600 angstroms, the structure of this flare coming off the surface of the sun looks totally different. So we need to do multi-wavelength observations. Okay, so I've been very interested in the closest star to us, because it's the easiest to observe, and also has a potentially habitable planet, right? So this is Proxima. Proxima is about 5 billion years old, and it has Proxima Cen b, which is a roughly Earth-mass planet in the habitable zone of the star. It has 2 other potential planets around it, a closer one that's smaller, and a sort of 6 Earth-mass planet out at a 1.5 AU. And it got a lot of attention a few years ago because a group went and looked at it with ALMA, because they wanted to try and see whether there was dust around the star. As now we have our closest star, and it has multiple planets around it. Maybe it also has Kuiper belt and asteroid belt analogs, and then we'd have this nice analog of our solar system. So the left image here is all of the ALMA observations, because they actually spent about 13 hours observing the system. And if you take all that data together, you get the image on the left. And it has a bright point source in the center. It's in excess of what we would think the stellar flux would be. So this was initially interpreted as an asteroid belt, in that because we're seeing excess emission in the millimeter, there must be dust around the star, where the star is heating this dust up, and it's glowing at millimeter wavelengths. There's also these kind of blobs of emission around the outer part here, and that was claimed as an outer Kuiper belt analog. You sort of squint your eyes and imagine that those 5 blobs are actually one disk that's been over-resolved. Okay, if you look at the observations individually and take just the first 12 hours, you get the panel in the middle, which looks strikingly different. That center point source is almost not detected at all. All we can do is place a 3 sigma upper limit on it. And if you look at the last hour of observations, you get the panel on the right, where now there's this enormously bright point source. So ALMA actually has an integration time of down to 1 second, which means we can do much better and make a complete light curve of that last observation, in which case there isn't actually any emission from the star for most of it, except for 2 minutes when the star goes through this series of small fluctuations, and then a giant flare where it brightens by a factor of almost 1,000 and then fades back down to nothing. So that's bad news for the disks, because all of that excess emission is not actually a constant excess from dust getting heated up, but instead due to this one flaring event. But very exciting, because it was the first time we'd actually detected a flare at millimeter wavelengths from an M dwarf. So, of course, the obvious question is, how does that fit into our understanding of flares in general? So we've been undertaking this large multi-wavelength observing campaign, where I tried to convince every telescope possible to stare at one star for 40 hours together. And we executed this campaign using ALMA, and then several ground-based optical telescopes to do photometry and spectroscopy. We coordinated with TESS, and then with Hubble, Swift, and Chandra to cover all the way out into the far ultraviolet and X-ray. I will say multi-wavelength observing campaigns are a nightmare, but you can get some really beautiful data like this. So this is the brightest flare we've ever detected from Proxima to date, and it's stepping through. The left plot is showing wavelengths from different facilities. So we have ALMA at the top, and then down through TESS, DuPont in H-alpha and helium-1, and then Hubble at the bottom in both continuum and the silicon 4 line. The right is just zooming in on the ALMA and the Hubble data together. So this flare brightens by more than a factor of 1,000 with ALMA and more than a factor of almost 15,000 with Hubble. It's enormous. And what was very surprising is that the ALMA and the Hubble data are basically in lockstep with each other. If you look at them, they have a huge brightening and they go up and down almost in perfect time. Each of these points is 1 second, so the entire flare lasts for a total of about 8 seconds. And what's even more puzzling is actually the fact that the optical data is delayed. So we don't see TESS peak up until a couple minutes afterwards. And the lines in the DuPont are actually more in sync with this little flare, this kind of secondary event, which we don't even see in ALMA or the Hubble continuum. So the kind of gold standard for understanding atmospheric processing is to look in these ultraviolet wavelengths because it's UV light that's most damaging to exoplanet atmospheres. And oftentimes, the best we can do is look in the optical, right? So a lot of flare work is done in the optical, and then we try and scale to UV energies. If the optical and the UV don't trace each other as well, that could be problematic. And I think it's very interesting to sort of probe into this because it might be that the millimeter is a very good tracer of the UV emission, especially if we think that the millimeter and the UV are both coming from that synchrotron radiation high up in the loop. They're tracing the same emission process. And so we might be able to use millimeter observations, which we can do easily from the ground, to actually infer the high energy radiation for these various exoplanet atmospheres. Just to highlight the difference with the optical again, this is now showing all of the flares detected from Proxima with both the Everyscope and with TESS. These are flare frequency distributions, so it's showing cumulative number of flares as a function of energy and amplitude. Same plot, you can pick which one. And the green line is indicating that flare that I just showed, this huge, brightened by 15,000 with Hubble flare. It is tiny in energy in the TESS bandpass. It actually is so small that we would expect flares of that amplitude to occur once per day in the optical, and more than 75% of the flares observed by TESS from Proxima are brighter than that. So it's by far the brightest flare we've ever seen in the millimeter and the UV from Proxima, but it's tiny in the optical. Now, ALMA lets us get some more information about the emission processes because ALMA doesn't observe at a single frequency. It observes across what we call a bandpass, which is a range of frequency, and it observes jointly in the XX and YY polarizations, so dual polarization, which means we can actually recreate and place a lower limit on the fractional linear polarization of the emission. So the left two panels here are showing previous flares that we'd observed with ALMA from Proxima and AUMIC. And the top is showing that flux density, so that's just the total flux of the flare as a function of time. The middle is showing the spectral index, so flux as a function of frequency, so how the flux slope changes as a function of frequency across that bandpass. And then the bottom is showing that fractional linear polarization. The right panel is showing that giant flare that we detected with Hubble and ALMA. And as we start to build a sample, we're starting to see some trends here. So there's a noticeable change in the spectral index of these stars as they flare. We see this start at a Rayleigh-Jeans tail like we would expect in the millimeter, and then this shift to a very steeply negative spectral index. And there's also indication of linear polarization coming from the star at the same time. So we can say even more about the emission mechanisms, and this supports the idea that there's some kind of synchrotron emission here because we're seeing this polarization change. Okay, we've also now tried to pair in the X-ray and the millimeter, so this is some work from my postdoc, Ward Howard. He's been looking at Chandra and ALMA observations, so this is the first flare we've ever detected simultaneously with the millimeter and the X-ray. It's a pretty interesting flare because it's actually quite small. It's comparable to sort of like an X-class flare from the sun, which for M dwarfs is minuscule. Big for our sun, tiny for M dwarfs. And it's actually a pretty complex flare, so you can see this multiple peak structure in the Chandra light curve, and we see multiple peaks in the ALMA light curve as well. And what we were able to do here is to actually start because it's comparable to the sun, start trying to look at how these flares on M-dwarfs map to sort of our understanding of solar flares. So this is showing us putting this flare on the kind of classic Gödel-Benz plot relationship, where we're showing luminosity in the radio as a function of X-ray luminosity. And it is roughly consistent, except that the millimeter flux is anomalously high. So if we look at the quiescent point, we're sort of consistent with the Gödel-Benz relationship, but during the flare, there's some kind of overproduction of millimeter emission that we don't actually have a good understanding of why yet. Okay. Of course, it's not just Proxima and M-dwarfs that flare at these wavelengths too. So these are several highlights of stars that are sun-like stars flaring in the millimeter, detected by luck with ALMA. So the left are 3 flares we detected from Epsilon Eridani, and the right is a flare actually from that HD 53143 observation that I already showed you, because it has a beautiful disk. It also has a star in the center of it that decided to flare. So you can see the light curve. Each of these points are our individual observations, and there's this huge jump at one point where the star had a lovely flaring event. Okay, so moving forward, I have been spending a bunch of time recently on kind of trying to think about like what telescopes we need to do better. So I've been working on a new mission concept called SPEX, which is the Early Star and Planet Evolution Explorer. And the goal of this mission is basically to do tests, but multi-wavelength. Because instead of trying to get 8 telescopes to all look at your star together, it would be really nice if there was one telescope that had multiple filters on it, and we could look in multiple band passes simultaneously at a fast cadence. So the goal here is actually to have near-IR optical and UV fast cadence observations looking at actually young stellar clusters, to look at young stars and try and understand both astroseismology and flaring and accretion events and exoplanets together. And then I also think it's worth highlighting the fact that there's going to be a whole lot of new all-sky surveys coming online. Something like CMB S4, which is not normally interested in flaring stars, can actually do quite a lot. And SPT has had multiple papers come out now where they have noticed that the foregrounds in their CMB observations are actually flaring stars. And they expect to detect a huge number of flaring stars in the millimeter wavelengths just by chance, because as they map the entire night sky in millimeter observations night after night after night, they're going to get all sorts of fun foregrounds. Okay. Going a step beyond that, I am been taking some new projects on to actually try and quantify what this does, right? It's one thing to talk about flares, and they're so dramatic, and they might damage atmospheres, but we don't have a great handle on exactly how bad that is. So I've been working with Laura Schaefer at Stanford and actually a geneticist at the University of Minnesota to try a crazy experiment where we actually take flaring spectra, input them into atmospheric models, predict the oxygen abundance, and then recreate this in a lab and try and see whether this really damages RNA and DNA. So we're going to simulate flaring in a lab with these UV flash bulbs to actually try and quantify how much damage is really potentially done to life forms if you are, an alien living on a Proxima Cen-B. And we're especially interested in oxygen because oxygen is frequently talked about as a biosignature. Because on Earth, we had this moment where plants started producing a huge amount of oxygen, and there's this oxygenation event in Earth's history where you suddenly see this boom in oxygen that wasn't in early Earth's atmosphere. However, UV emission from flares can actually cause you to lose hydrogen out of your atmosphere, dissociate your water molecules, and end up producing this remnant pileup of oxygen. So this is showing models of oxygen pressure as a function in the habitable zone as a result of flaring, where just by running a whole lot of flares through an atmosphere, you can actually build up this huge partial pressure of oxygen. So we're trying to better evaluate whether oxygen really is a good biosignature or not. Okay, so I have to come back to this. We've tackled a few of these, but only kind of barely scratched the surface. And there are a few other areas that I think we really need to do some work in order to get at the idea of habitability. Because right now, none of this is telling us what the volatile and water content of our disks and planets are. So how might we do that? Back to disks. This is a lovely, complicated plot of all of the kind of complexity that's happening in disks. On the left is showing protoplanetary disks, and on the right is debris disks. And it's highlighting these sort of different chemical gradients in disks, because as you move outwards in disks, you're actually getting a temperature profile. And there's a temperature gradient as a function of scale height, because protoplanetary disks are actually thick, they're flared out. So this is tracing sort of where gas might be and where ice might be and how the C/O ratio actually changes in disks. Layer on top of that the fact that different wavelengths of light are actually tracing different temperatures. So depending upon the facility I pick, like ALMA, I'm very sensitive to cold Kuiper belt analogs. If I look with JWST, I'm more sensitive to something maybe like an asteroid belt analog moving inwards. Thrown down at the bottom of here is where the known exoplanet orbits are, which don't overlap with any of those outer disk structures that we're actually looking at, right? And ALMA, furthermore, is really good at looking at very complex molecules, things like CO, formaldehyde, methane. But it is not good at looking at atomic species, and it can't look at anything like water. Okay, so it's a mess. How do we do better? The answer, I actually think, here is to look at a different wavelength of light. We need something that operates in the far infrared, because the far infrared is absolutely critical to filling in all the gaps and the things that we currently don't know. So I've been working with Asantha Kore on a telescope called FIRST, which is the Far Infrared Spectroscopic Survey Telescope, with the goal of actually answering all these questions and making that plot not so complicated. So what are some of those problems? For one thing, we actually do not know how much mass is in planetary disks, which I should be able to tell you. I showed you all these beautiful images and told you that we can infer planetary masses, but we actually don't know the masses of the disks. This plot is showing estimates of masses from one disk. This is TW Hydra, and every single one of those points is a different mass estimate for this disk, and the scale is logarithmic. It's like orders of magnitude. So what gives? Well, one thing is that we think that the bulk of the mass is in hydrogen, but we can't observe hydrogen. So the best we can do with ALMA is look at CO and think that CO is tracing the hydrogen reservoir. And if we measure CO, we can then scale it to a mass of hydrogen. But CO is often optically thick, which means we're not actually probing all the material. And there's a bunch of systematic uncertainties in taking something like CO and scaling it to hydrogen that we don't understand very well. So we get this huge scatter. There is something better, which is HD, deuterated hydrogen. So HD is at least hydrogen, right? So we're on a good step there. And it has two transitions at 112 and 56 microns that are in the far infrared. It was looked at with Herschel for one disk, TW Hydra. And you can see the points at the top now are actually the measurements from HD. And they are better, but there's still quite a bit of scatter there. And the reason is that HD is super sensitive to temperature. So you need to know the temperature of your gas, which means you need to know where it is in your disk pretty precisely in order to actually back out a mass accurately. If you don't understand the temperature, you still end up with quite a large error bar compared to how accurately we'd like to know masses in disks. So you can fix that by having much higher spectral resolution than Herschel did. With high spectral resolution, you can actually resolve the line as a function of velocity, because the line is getting broadened by the rotation of the disk. So with high enough resolution, you get tomography, what we call tomography, mapping of that line, which gives you the radiolocation, and now you can get disk masses. Okay. Water is fundamental for all things habitability. And we like to draw this very simple picture of water being inherited from star formation through planet formation into planetary systems, and water just somehow magics along this path. But we actually have very little data, and the reason is that we actually just can't detect water right now. This is showing all of the energy transitions of water up to 1,000 Kelvin as a function of wavelength. And there are some high energy water lines that JWST can look at and has looked at. So JWST can probe really hot energetic water. There are a few lines that are technically accessible to ALMA, but are never actually observed because we live on a planet that has an atmosphere that's full of water. So the atmosphere is essentially opaque. And all the rest of the transitions of water are all in the far infrared. So any water line that you ever want to look at is in the far infrared. Okay, where would we want to look at water? Well, we'd like to understand water in disks, because when we tried to look with Herschel, Herschel actually didn't detect water in the very small handful of disks it looked at, which is weird, because if we assume the abundance of the ISM should be the same in disks because of this nice linear trajectory, then we should have detected water in disks. So it indicates that potentially there's a chemical change happening in disks where the water abundances are getting reset somehow in this planet formation process. Or maybe water is getting frozen out and it's in ice, so we're not looking at the right energies. This is a simulated spectrum of just the wealth of water lines that you might expect to see in the infrared, because we would expect to see water lines everywhere from about 30 to 500 and something microns. The water lines are really narrow, so if you want to detect water, you need really high, precise resolution. Another basic question is where our water came from on our planet, right? We formed within the snow line of our solar system, so Earth should not have had any water to start with. So all of our water has to have been delivered. And the question is, what reservoir of the solar system delivered that water? We can try and get at that by measuring what's called the D to H ratio. So any natural reservoir of water has normal water in it, and then it has HDO, deuterated water. And the percentage of deuterated water versus normal water is like a fingerprint of the reservoir of that water. So if you measure the D to H ratio, you're measuring that fraction. And different bodies have different D to H ratios. So this is showing our solar system and the D to H ratio for Earth compared with various bodies in the solar system. And right now, it looks like asteroids might be the best fit, but we actually just don't really have the comet data. Comets are faint and they're hard to detect, they're hard to track. So most of those are upper limits, and the sample size is very small. And to really answer this question, we need to go and look at a lot more comets and measure their D to H ratios. So we need water lines and HDO lines again in the far infrared. So I think this is really exciting because we haven't had a far infrared telescope at a moment when we have all this knowledge about planet formation. Herschel ended its mission as ALMA was coming online. So there's only this tiny overlap where suddenly everybody was like, oh, wait, planet formation is really cool. Oh, now we don't have an infrared telescope anymore. So with a new facility operating in the far infrared, we can actually answer all of these questions, right? We can learn how much mass is available for planets. We can actually place constraints on the time scale of planet formation. How long do disks last? We can understand the chemistry of these disks. We can look for water, and we can actually really get a handle on planetary habitability. Okay, so with that sales pitch for the far infrared, I will end with some take-home messages, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Meredith. That was an awesome, awesome talk. So many different projects going on. So yeah, we have time for a few questions. If anyone in the room has any, or if you're online, you can feel free to raise your hand.
Hello. Good, it works. I'm still hung up on the fact that there is a predictable thinning of the disk between the, oh my God, Peri and Apo.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. So is that thinning something that would follow the planet as it goes, or is it always thinner at one end than the other?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to draw on a whiteboard. Okay, this will work. Great. So the prediction is actually depending upon if you have a planet that is orbiting within the disk, you actually expect it to basically shepherd the orbits of bodies. So if I draw like one eccentric orbit, right, here's my star. If I have a planet, what tends to happen and what we see in like our Kuiper belt is that Neptune actually pinches the orbits of Kuiper belt objects at pericenter. So it basically like nests orbits so that they share like a common pericenter point, but they stretch out at apocenter. So there's some like additional scatter in the eccentricity of orbits and some spread in their semi-major axis, but Neptune actually is like pinching the orbits of the Kuiper belt objects to match at pericenter. So you end up narrowing at pericenter and being broader at apocenter, which is like contrary to if you just pump up eccentricities, but they don't actually like get shepherded, you kind of start creating like lots of very dramatic scatter and eccentricities, but you don't end up with that pinching. Does that help?
Does anyone else have any other questions?
So one of the things that limited Herschel's impact is it just didn't last that long. Can a far-infrared mission last longer than Herschel did?
Yes. Because we've come a long way in like cryogenic technologies, right? So like the key in the far infrared is that it has to be cold. And Herschel had expendable cryocooler. So as soon as we ran out of expendable stuff, then that's the end of Herschel. But now there's, you know, these CAT or continuous ADRs and all sorts of new cryotechnologies that do not have that problem. So we could have a much longer far infrared mission.
Just thinking back to the D-sharp images from ALMA, like the more I look at them, the more I think that basically by the time we even see those protoplanetary disks, if that structure is giant planets, they've already completely formed by the time we even see the disk as revealed. Mm-hmm. So how much time do we actually have to form giant planets? Is it somewhere between 0 and 1 million years? It seems like they must go incredibly fast. Or are those structures, not all of them are planets, or what's the consensus view at the moment?
I mean, it seems that things have to happen pretty quickly because there are examples of disks that have structure in them with ALMA that are like 500,000 years old. So if that structure is getting carved by planets, which, you know, some of it might not be, because some of those D-sharp disks, like the gas and the dust, show different gap structures. And so you might expect that if it's all planets, then they would line up. So maybe if you're seeing different gaps, there's maybe some snow line or optical depth effects. But planets are they work best so far. Then things have to happen really fast because you have to have completely cleared those gaps by 2 million years, and you start clearing them at 500,000 years.
Yeah, I mean, it was always a struggle back in the day to form planets quickly enough. Like when I was in like undergrad or something, we thought we had like, you know, a gig a year or something, you know, to like form the solar system. And then in grad school, it's like, maybe you got 10 million years. And now it's like you got less than 1 million years to form the giant planets. Like, can the giant planet formation models actually do this without turning up the disk masses to ridiculous levels?
Well, I think there's two pieces, right? I mean, yes, it has to happen fast. I don't think it's 100% clear like when it ends, because we don't actually have a good handle on how quickly everything photoevaporates away. So there's definitely structure happening in those disks, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is totally finished, because we don't actually have like lifetimes for disks. But on the other hand, there's a lot of very exotic models where now we start invoking things like streaming instabilities and like magic happens and planets just kaboom, form in tiny fractions of orbital timescales.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of the cores, you know, just before you even put on the gas envelopes. Forming a 10 Earth mass core in, 500,000 years that's
really challenging to plan a
challenging,
formation model.
seriously challenging unless the disks are incredibly much more massive than we think.
Right, which we don't know.
Yes, all right, HD.
I'm really interested in what the stellar variability looks like at visible wavelengths, and you showed Proxima Cyn there, and you said it was a small change of visible wavelengths, but it looked like a huge factor still to me. Can you comment on just taking HC 53143 as an example, which is a G9 main sequence star? Talk about like what you might expect the magnitude to be at visible wavelengths. Is it a 1% effect, a 10% effect?
Yeah. So this plot, right, these are like normalized flux to the mean, so it's like a brightening factor. So the test brightened by a factor of 10, and ALMA brightened by a factor of 1,000. So for here, ALMA only brightened by a factor of about, 3, factor of a few. So the optical would be then
30%.
pretty small.
Oh, right, 3%.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
The background of this is actually the TESS light curve. So that gray line in the background is actually TESS data because TESS just happened to be observing when we were looking with ALMA. And there's huge variability in the TESS light curve, right? There's this huge fluctuation happening in it, which is why there's all that spot modulation. But if there was an optical flare, we should have seen it in the TESS data, and there's not anything apparent. So either that means that there is a flare and it's just really, really tiny, or it's not totally ruled out that there just isn't an optical counterpoint part to that. If they really are decoupled, there are other examples in our 40 hours of Proxima data where we see ALMA flares and HST flares and there's nothing in the optical.
All right. Well, we are a little bit over the hour, so I want to make sure everyone has time to get lunch. But I think Meredith has time maybe this afternoon. Also, there was discussion about getting lunch. So if anyone wants to stick around and we can figure out the logistics of that. But I want to thank Meredith again for the great talk. And thanks everyone for coming out. And anyone online who wants to get in touch with Meredith, feel free to send me an email and I can put you in touch.